If your love is real, the recording will prove it.
One day, you'll regret doubting the only person who never betrayed you.
He recorded his wife, believing she was the traitor.
Lord, protect the man who no longer trusts me.
I was hunting a betrayer, but I found my own reflection.
The Korean Mafia boss secretly recorded his black wife. What he heard destroyed everything he believed. Kang Ji-hoon inherited 3 things from his father: a mafia empire spanning half of Seoul, a scar over his left eyebrow that women found mysterious and men found terrifying, and a chronic inability to trust anyone who smiled at him without an invoice attached. In his world, kindness was a transaction disguised as a virtue, and love was just loyalty with better lighting.
You're officially part of the elite family. So don't forget to like, share,
And most importantly, subscribe.
We'll see you in the next story.
So when his advisors told him it was time to marry, he treated the search like a hostile takeover. He interviewed candidates the way other men interviewed accountants, checking their family ties, their debts, their capacity to keep secrets. Then Zara walked into the room wearing a red dress and an expression that said she had already decided she didn't need his approval, and Ji-hoon, for the first time in his adult life, forgot how to finish a sentence. Zara was not Korean, not intimidated, and not, as his uncle Tae-sung loudly complained at the engagement dinner, appropriately grateful. She had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a preacher and a woman who ran a bakery with the discipline of a drill sergeant, and she carried herself like someone who had never once needed a man's money to feel like somebody. Ji-hoon found this unbearably attractive and deeply suspicious in equal measure, which, in hindsight, tells you everything you need to know about his emotional education. Their courtship was fast, the way house fires are fast. Within a year they were married. Within 2 they were the kind of couple photographed at charity galas with captions like "Seoul's most powerful pairing," which is a polite way of saying everyone was waiting for it to blow up. It nearly did, and this is where our first climax arrives, sharp and unglamorous. 6 months into the marriage, Ji-hoon's rival, a slick, ambitious lieutenant named Hyun-woo who had been quietly building his own faction for years, began feeding him anonymous messages. Grainy photos of Zara meeting strange men in parking garages. Voice memos, poorly edited, claiming she was funneling family secrets to a rival syndicate in Busan. Ji-hoon, a man who could smell a lie from across a boardroom, somehow could not smell one sitting across his own dinner table. Suspicion, it turns out, is the one poison that tastes exactly like proof. Instead of asking his wife a single direct question, which would have taken roughly 4 seconds and saved everyone a great deal of trouble, Ji-hoon did what powerful men with trust issues and too much disposable income always do. He hired a surveillance expert and turned his mansion into a haunted house of hidden microphones, tucked behind Zara's collection of framed Bible verses, and inside the ficus, she insisted on watering herself because, quote, "some things a woman does not delegate." For weeks he collected nothing but the mundane poetry of a life he refused to see clearly. Zara humming gospel songs off-key while she cooked. Zara arguing with a delivery driver about a bruised mango with the ferocity of a woman defending a border. Zara whispering prayers at 2 in the morning, not for herself, but for him, for his soul, for the men he'd hurt, for a redemption he'd never once asked for and didn't think he deserved. Then came the second climax, the one that actually mattered. One ordinary Tuesday, alone in the one room in the mansion she never let staff clean, Zara finally said it out loud, to no one, to God, to the walls. The strange men in the garages weren't lovers or spies. They were private investigators she had hired herself, using money from her own bakery consulting business, because months earlier she'd discovered that Hyun-woo had been quietly poisoning Ji-hoon's tea with a slow-acting compound designed to look like stress-induced heart failure. She hadn't told Ji-hoon because she knew, with the tired clarity of a woman who'd learned to read danger the way other people read weather, that if she accused a made man without ironclad proof, it would start a war that would swallow them both. So she built her case in silence, in parking garages, with cash and patience and a terrifying amount of faith, while her husband quietly began suspecting her of the very betrayal she was working, unpaid and unthanked, to prevent. Here is your sharp plot twist, delivered without a drumroll because Zara doesn't do drumrolls. The anonymous tips Ji-hoon received weren't from a jealous rival at all. They were sent by Hyun-woo himself, the poisoner, hoping suspicion would tear the marriage apart before Zara finished gathering evidence against him. He wasn't just trying to kill Ji-hoon slowly. He was trying to make sure that when Ji-hoon finally died, his own wife would be the prime suspect, conveniently removing two obstacles with one very patient lie. Ji-hoon, headphones still on, sat in the dark and realized he had spent weeks recording proof of his own paranoia while his wife had spent that same time quietly saving his life. Somewhere in Seoul, a mafia boss who had never once lost a negotiation finally understood he'd been losing the only one that mattered, and he hadn't even known he was playing. Beck delivered the T-test results 4 days late, which in his defense was 3 days faster than his usual pace for paperwork he considered beneath him. He walked into Ji-hoon's office holding the folder like it might bite him, which, in a sense, it did. Trace amounts of foxglove extract, Beck said. Small doses. Consistent with something added over weeks, not months. Enough to mimic cardiac strain. Enough that a coroner would write natural causes and go home for dinner. Ji-hoon set down his cup very slowly, the way a man sets down anything he suddenly suspects of wanting him dead. Who has access to my private stock? Kitchen staff. Your taster. Hyun-woo, when he visits. Ji-hoon almost laughed. Almost. Hyun-woo had been at his side since they were teenagers running errands for men who are all dead now, mostly because of choices Ji-hoon had made and Hyun-woo had helped him make. Suspecting him felt like suspecting his own right hand of trying to strangle him, which, to be fair, is exactly the kind of thing a right hand would do if it had been quietly practicing. Watch him, Ji-hoon said. Don't touch him. Watch. That night, the recordings from Zara's study finally gave him something that wasn't a hymn or an argument about hydrangeas. It was her voice, low and urgent, on a call he hadn't authorized anyone to monitor because he genuinely hadn't known that particular line existed. Suwa, I need everything you have by Friday. If I'm right about the timeline, he doesn't have until Friday. Ji-hoon's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the foxglove. He replayed it 11 times. Not because the words changed, but because his understanding of them refused to sit still. A rival's name would have been simple. A lover's name would have been almost a relief, something he could put a bullet in and grieve properly. But he doesn't have until Friday sounded less like betrayal and more like a countdown, and Ji-hoon, despite years of training himself to see conspiracies in every shadow, could not for the life of him figure out whose shadow this was. He confronted her the only way a man like him knew how to confront anything, sideways, armored, pretending it didn't matter. You've been busy, he said at dinner, watching her over a glass of wine he suddenly didn't trust either. Parking garages. Strange men. Urgent phone calls about deadlines. Zara didn't flinch, which somehow unsettled him more than flinching would have. Are you having me followed, Ji-hoon? Or are you finally asking me a question like a husband instead of accusing me like a prosecutor? Both, he admitted, because lying to her had never worked and he'd stopped bothering to pretend otherwise. She studied him for a long moment, weighing something he couldn't name, and for the first time since the anonymous messages started, Ji-hoon felt the true terror of a man who realizes he might be about to hear an answer he isn't ready for. When you're ready to actually trust me, she said finally, standing, smoothing her dress like she was smoothing over the whole conversation. I'll tell you everything. Until then, keep listening to whatever it is you've got hidden in my ficus. I hope it's educational. She walked out, leaving Ji-hoon alone with a wine glass, a folder of poison results, and the sinking realization that his wife had known about the surveillance for who knows how long and had simply decided to outpatience him. 2 floors below, Hyun-woo sat in his own quiet office, scrolling through a message thread with a burner account, watching the countdown he'd built with his own hands tick steadily toward Friday. Zara's investigator had gotten closer than he'd planned for, close enough that he could either accelerate the poison or accelerate the frame job, and a man in his position had learned long ago that when you can't outrun a problem, you make sure it looks like someone else's crime scene. He typed one more anonymous message, the cruelest one yet, Time to land exactly when Ji-hoon's suspicion was at its most flammable, and hit send with the calm satisfaction of a man setting a very patient fire. Upstairs, Ji-hoon's phone buzzed once, then went dark, the way bad news always seems to know exactly when to arrive. The message was short, which somehow made it worse. Long lies invite scrutiny. Short ones just sit there, daring you to fill in the rest yourself. She's not protecting you. She's protecting her payday. Ask her who really owns the bakery. Ji-hoon read it 4 times, and each time his mind, that finely tuned machine built for spotting weakness in men, did something it had never done before. It turned its scrutiny on the one person he'd never actually investigated. He'd checked Zara's family, her friends, her old employers, back when she was just a candidate in a file. But somewhere between the wedding and the war he was currently losing to his own paranoia, he'd stopped checking and started assuming, and assumption, he was beginning to learn, is just laziness wearing a wedding ring. He called Beck at midnight. Pull everything on the bakery. Ownership, investors, every account tied to it. By morning, Beck returned with a spreadsheet and the expression of a man delivering news he already knew would land badly. The bakery's clean. Zara owns 60% outright, but the other 40% was bought out 8 months ago by a shell company. He paused, the way people pause right before handing you a grenade with the pin already gone. The shell company traces back to Hyunwoo. Ji-hoon sat with that for a long moment, feeling the floor of his certainty tilt sideways. Hyunwoo, quietly buying into his wife's business. Hyunwoo, standing at their wedding with a smile Ji-hoon had never once questioned. Hyunwoo, who had access to his tea, his schedule, his blind spots, all of them, because Ji-hoon had handed him the keys to his life a decade ago and never once asked for them back. He wanted it to mean Zara was compromised. It would have been so much simpler that way, a clean villain, a clean divorce, a clean bullet. Instead, it meant something far more inconvenient, that his wife might be tangled in a trap she hadn't set, and that the only way to find out the truth was to do the one thing he'd been avoiding since this whole mess began. Ask her. He found her in the study, the one room she never let staff clean, standing very still in front of the ficus with her arms crossed, looking directly at the exact spot where the microphone was hidden, as though she'd known its location since the day it was installed and had simply been waiting for him to be brave enough to show up in person instead of through a wire. Tell me about the shell company, he said, skipping every pleasantry he might have used a year ago. Tell me about Hyunwoo owning 40% of your bakery. Something in Zara's face cracked, not with guilt, but with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying a truth alone for so long that being finally asked for it feels less like relief and more like being asked to set down a piano she's been holding since the wedding. He didn't buy in because he believes in artisan sourdough, Ji-hoon, she said quietly. He bought in so he'd have a legal reason to be near me, near my accounts, near anything I might be building without your permission. He's been watching me the same way you've been listening to me. The difference is I noticed him first. Why didn't you tell me? Because the moment I told you, you would have done something loud, she said. And loud men in this family end up dead, Ji-hoon, or they end up making their enemies disappear before those enemies finish confessing everything they know. I needed him talking, not buried. I needed proof, not a body. Ji-hoon opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because for the first time in this entire miserable saga, the woman in front of him wasn't the mystery.
He was.
He'd spent weeks treating his own wife like a hostile witness, while the actual threat had been standing next to him at family dinners, refilling his tea with a smile. Sua's deadline, he said slowly. Friday. What happens Friday? Zara's expression went cold in a way he'd never seen on her before, something ancient and unbothered by the idea of consequences. Friday, the investigator finishes tracing every payment Hyunwoo made to the pharmacist. Friday, I was going to hand you enough proof that even you couldn't talk yourself out of believing it. Outside the study door, unnoticed by either of them, Hyunwoo stood with his hand raised to knock, close enough to hear every word, his carefully constructed patience finally, audibly, running out. Hyunwoo had built his entire strategy on a simple premise. Patient men win, and impatient men leave bodies for other people to explain. He'd poisoned Ji-hoon slowly for exactly this reason, so slowly that even Ji-hoon's own doctors would eventually write it off as stress, ambition, the cost of doing business in a family that measured success in enemies made. It was meant to look like nothing at all, right up until it looked like everything. But standing outside that study door, hearing his own name spoken aloud alongside the words pharmacist and proof, Hyunwoo felt a decade of careful patience evaporate in about 4 seconds, which is roughly how long it takes a man to realize his exit has just been sealed shut behind him. He pushed the door open before he'd fully decided to. "Since we're all being honest tonight," he said, and his voice carried the particular brightness of a man who has already resigned himself to violence and is simply choosing his opening line. "Let's be honest about everything, shall we?" Ji-hoon turned, and the look on his face was not rage, which surprised even him. It was something colder, quieter, the look of a man doing math he should have done years ago. "You've been in this house 1,000 times, Hyunwoo. You held my father's hand when he died. You held mine at the funeral. And you never once asked why your father died 2 years earlier than his doctors predicted," Hyunwoo said, and the room went very, very still. "You inherited everything, Ji-hoon. The territory, the loyalty, the fear. I inherited the job of standing one step behind you for the rest of my life, watching you get everything I built half of. I got tired of standing behind. I decided to stand in front. Eventually, once you were conveniently out of the way and grieving, you looked appropriately tragic on camera." Zara's hand found Ji-hoon's arm, not to restrain him, but to steady him, the way you steady someone who's just been told the ground under their entire childhood was never solid to begin with. "You killed my father," Ji-hoon said, and it wasn't a question, because somewhere underneath the shock, a part of him had always half known, the way you half know a floorboard is rotten long before you fall through it. "I encouraged an outcome," Hyunwoo said, with the specific smugness of a man who has clearly practiced this distinction in a mirror. "There's a difference legally and spiritually. There is no version of spirituality where that holds up," Zara said flatly, and despite everything, despite the poison and the lies and the decade of quiet betrayal unraveling in real time, there was something almost funny about a mafia boss's wife correcting a would-be murderer's theology in the middle of his own confession. Hyunwoo's hand drifted toward his jacket, slow and almost regretful, like a man reaching for an umbrella he'd hoped he wouldn't need. "I'd hoped this could stay elegant. Anonymous tips, a slow poison, a grieving widow eventually persuaded to sell me her shares out of sheer exhaustion. But elegance requires everyone to play their part, and neither of you seem particularly interested in playing along." "No," Zara said, stepping slightly, deliberately in front of Ji-hoon. "We tend not to." It was, Ji-hoon would think later, the single most terrifying and most romantic sentence anyone had ever said in his defense, delivered by a woman he'd spent weeks suspecting of exactly the crime the man in front of them had actually committed. Outside the study, footsteps thundered down the hallway. Beck and 2 of the house guards, alerted the moment Zara had triggered a silent signal she'd built into the study months ago, precisely because she'd never fully trusted the house's silence to protect either of them. Hyunwoo heard the footsteps too, and for the first time all night, his patience finally, visibly, ran out. What the walls remembered for a man who prided himself on elegance, Hyunwoo's exit strategy was disappointingly clumsy. He lunged for the letter opener on Zara's desk, a decorative brass thing shaped like a phoenix that she'd bought at a market in Busan because she liked the symbolism, never once imagining she'd have to watch her husband wrestle a would-be assassin for it in real time. Ji-hoon moved first, not out of training, though he had plenty, but out of something raw, a decade of grief and betrayal finally finding a physical direction to travel in. He caught Hyunwoo's wrist before the phoenix ever left the desk, and the 2 men who had once split rice cakes as teenagers on a rooftop now grappled across a study floor like the family they'd built together had never existed at all. Beck and the guards arrived in time to see the end of it, which was less a fight than a confession with fists. Ji-hoon didn't kill him. He wanted to, badly, the way you want to slam a door that's already been slammed on you 100 times. But Zara's voice cut through the room, steady even as her hands shook. "Don't. Dead men don't testify, Ji-hoon. And I did not spend 3 months in parking garages building a case just so you could throw it away in 4 seconds because your feelings got hurt. It was, remarkably, the thing that stopped him. Not mercy. Logistics. Hyunwoo was dragged out still talking, still explaining, still convinced that somewhere in his own version of events he was the reasonable one, a man simply claiming what patience had earned him. The guards were significantly less interested in his reasoning than he'd hoped. What followed wasn't peace, not immediately. It was paperwork, of all things a strange, deflating anticlimax after weeks of poison and surveillance and betrayal. Suah delivered her final folder 2 days early, thick with bank transfers, pharmacy records, and a signed statement from the pharmacist who'd suddenly discovered a passionate interest in cooperating with authorities once he learned exactly whose husband he'd helped poison. The family council, the same stone-faced elders who had once called Zara inappropriately ungrateful, sat through 6 hours of evidence and left the room considerably quieter than they'd entered it. Ji-hoon spent that first night afterward not in his office, not in the soundproof surveillance room he'd built to spy on the one person who'd been protecting him, but sitting on the floor of Zara's study, staring at the ficus like it owed him an apology. "I should tell you," he said finally when Zara found him there. "There are microphones. In here. In the kitchen. In the garden." "I know," she said, sitting down across from him, unbothered, the way you're unbothered by news you've been sitting on for weeks. "I found the first one in March. I let you keep listening." Ji-hoon stared at her.
Why?
"Because a man who's actually listening eventually hears the truth, even if he's too stubborn to ask for it directly," she said. "I figured you'd get there. I just didn't expect Hyunwoo to nearly kill you before you did. It should have been the moment for a great romantic declaration, the kind his advisors would have scripted for a press release. Instead, Ji-hoon just laughed, low and disbelieving, the exhausted laugh of a man who has spent weeks building a fortress against an enemy who turned out to be standing right beside him, wearing his wife's face in his imagination and his best friend's smile in reality. "I bugged my own wife," he said, "to catch a traitor, and the whole time she was the only person in this house who wasn't lying to me." "Took you long enough," Zara said, and reached over to switch off the last recording device herself, the little red light blinking out for good. The bride wore evidence. 3 weeks after Hyunwoo's arrest, Seoul's underworld did what underworlds always do after a scandal. It threw a party. Not out of celebration, exactly, but out of the deep cultural understanding that nothing repairs a fractured criminal dynasty's reputation faster than a lavish gathering with excellent catering and just enough plausible deniability to keep everyone smiling for photographs. The occasion, officially, was the 6-month anniversary of Ji-hoon and Zara's marriage. Unofficially, it was a very expensive way of telling the family council, the rival syndicates, and anyone still whispering about the American wife that Kang Ji-hoon's house was not, in fact, crumbling. It was, if anything, sturdier than it had ever been, having just survived an internal coup led by a man everyone had trusted implicitly for a decade, which is either a terrible advertisement for the family's judgment or an excellent one for its recovery skills, depending entirely on how the wine hits you. Zara stood in front of the mirror in a gown the color of good judgment, deep emerald, structured enough to suggest she meant business, soft enough to remind everyone she wasn't required to prove it anymore. Her stylist, a nervous young woman named Yoon-hee, who had clearly heard every rumor about the household and was doing her best not to stare at Zara like she might combust, fussed with the hem. "You seem calm," Yoon-hee offered, the way people offer observations they're hoping will be corrected. "Given everything. Baby, I planned a wedding, survived a poisoning plot, and personally organized the folder that put a man away for attempted murder, all in the same calendar year," Zara said, adjusting an earring. "A party is the easy part." Down the hall, Ji-hoon was having a considerably less composed evening. He stood in front of his own mirror, tugging at a collar that had fit perfectly fine an hour ago and now felt like it belonged to a smaller, less complicated man, adjusting a tie for the 4th time while Beck hovered nearby with the barely concealed patience of a man who had spent the last 3 weeks fielding calls from elders who wanted assurances, apologies, and in one memorable case, a full seating chart guaranteeing they wouldn't be placed anywhere near the Busan faction, whose loyalty was still delicately being reassessed. "You're nervous," Beck said, which was less an observation than an accusation, since Ji-hoon had built an entire career on never once looking nervous in public, not during turf wars, not during police raids, not even at his own father's funeral, where he'd stood dry-eyed and unreadable while men twice his age wept openly. "I'm not nervous," Ji-hoon said, in the exact tone of a man who is extremely nervous. "I'm recalibrating." Recalibrating what? Whether a room full of people who spent 6 months quietly betting on my marriage failing deserves my best behavior tonight, or whether I should let Zara handle the toast unsupervised and simply enjoy the show. Beck, wisely, said nothing, because he had, in fact, been one of the people quietly betting on the marriage failing, a wager he'd already lost 40,000 won onto a cousin who'd bet on true love, of all the sentimental nonsense, and won. The party itself unfolded the way these things always did in Ji-hoon's world, gorgeous, tense, and one bad joke away from a diplomatic incident. String lights threaded through the mansion's private garden, the same garden where hidden microphones had once recorded Zara scolding a gardener over her hydrangeas. Waitstaff circulated with champagne and skewered things that were technically food but functioned mostly as excuses for guests to stand near each other while sizing up who among them might be the next Hyunwoo. Ji-hoon's aunt, a formidable woman named In-suk, who had opposed the marriage from the beginning on the grounds that Zara was, in her precise words, a beautiful distraction from family business, cornered the bride near the dessert table with the subtlety of a woman who had clearly rehearsed this conversation in a mirror of her own. "I hear you built quite the case against Hyunwoo," In-suk said, sipping champagne like it might reveal secrets if she drank it slowly enough. "Parking garages. Investigators. Very dramatic. Very necessary," Zara corrected pleasantly. "Though I appreciate you following the story closely. I didn't realize I had such an attentive audience." "One worries," In-suk said, "about a woman so comfortable operating in the shadows." "One worries," Zara said, matching her tone exactly, "about a family that spent a decade comfortable ignoring the shadows a man was operating in right under their noses, while criticizing the woman who actually did something about it. But I understand. It's easier to be suspicious of the new wife than the old friend. Habit's a powerful thing." In-suk's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Around them, several guests who had been very obviously not listening suddenly developed a keen interest in the dessert table's macarons. "You're sharper than I expected," In-suk said finally, and there was, underneath the frost, something that might have been the beginning of respect, the kind that takes root slowly in people who've spent their whole lives mistaking coldness for strength. "Ma'am," Zara said, popping a macaron with the calm of a woman who had survived worse conversations than this one before breakfast, "I run a bakery. I married into a Mafia family, and I did both without losing a single employee or a single husband. Sharp is the baseline. I have layers you haven't met yet." Across the garden, Ji-hoon watched this entire exchange from a polite distance, nursing a drink he wasn't really drinking, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the day the first anonymous message arrived. Whatever fear had once lived in him, the old suspicion that Zara was a liability, a mystery, a woman who might unravel everything he'd built, had been replaced by something considerably more useful, the realization that she was, and had always been, the most competent person in any room she walked into, including this one, including his own family. He found her an hour later near the fountain, having successfully extracted herself from 3 more probing conversations and 1 marriage proposal disguised as a business pitch from a distant cousin who clearly hadn't gotten the memo that she was, in fact, already married. "You survived my aunt," he said. "Your aunt survived me," Zara corrected. "There's a difference, and it's an important one for her ego going forward." Ji-hoon laughed, a real one, the kind that still surprised people who remembered the version of him that existed before this woman walked into his life and rearranged the furniture of who he thought he was. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one. Not the kind I give the council when I need something from them." "You already gave me one," Zara said, "on the floor of my study, next to the ficus you're still oddly suspicious of." "I'm not suspicious of the ficus. You watered it wrong last week out of spite." I saw you. That plant witnessed the worst weeks of my life, Ji-hoon said. We have a complicated relationship. Zara laughed, leaning into him, and for a moment the noise of the party, the elders and their calculations, the guards stationed discreetly at every exit, the weight of a legacy built on fear that both of them were slowly, deliberately trying to rebuild into something less brittle, all of it faded into background static. I keep thinking about Friday, Ji-hoon said quietly. The deadline. If Hyun-woo hadn't overheard us, if he'd waited, if Sua's folder had come 2 days later instead of 2 days early.
But it didn't, Zara said.
And he did overhear us. And I've made peace with not needing to relive every version of the story where it goes wrong, because I have exactly one version where it went right, and I'd like to enjoy it, if that's all right with you and you're recalibrating.
Beck told you about that.
Beck tells me everything.
He's terrified of me.
It's very useful. Ji-hoon shook his head, smiling in a way the old family photographs, the stern, unsmiling portraits of his father and grandfather, would never have permitted, and pulled her closer under the string lights. Somewhere behind them, In-suk was already composing the version of tonight's event she'd repeat to the council, considerably more flattering to Zara than her opening remarks had suggested she'd allow. The party would go on for hours yet, full of toasts and calculated smiles, and at least one more attempt by a distant cousin to pitch a business deal at the worst possible moment. But for now, standing by the fountain in a garden that had once hidden a stranger's microphones, Ji-hoon understood something that had taken him entire, expensive weeks of paranoia to learn. He had spent his whole life believing that power meant control, that safety meant surveillance, that love was just loyalty with better lighting. Zara had shown him, patiently, infuriatingly, at considerable personal risk, that real safety looked like a woman willing to spend 3 months in parking garages to protect a man too stubborn to ask for help, and that real power looked like trusting her enough, finally, to stop listening through walls and start actually hearing her instead. 6 weeks after the party, Kang Ji-hoon did something he had never done in his entire adult life. He asked for advice. Not from Beck, who had opinions about everything and tact about nothing. Not from the family council, whose collective wisdom mostly consisted of variations on "do what your father would have done," a standard Ji-hoon was beginning to suspect had gotten his father killed. He asked Zara, sitting across from her at the kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday morning, over coffee and a slightly burnt piece of toast that she insisted on eating anyway out of what she called Southern principle. Hyun-woo's trial starts next month, he said. The council wants me to testify.
Publicly.
On record. They think it will settle things once and for all, show the other families we handled our own rot instead of hiding it. And what do you want? It was, he realized, the first time in his life anyone had asked him that question and actually waited for the answer instead of already having a plan for him. His father never had. The council never had. Even Hyun-woo, in his own twisted way, had spent a decade deciding what Ji-hoon wanted before Ji-hoon ever got the chance to say it out loud. I want it to be over, he admitted. I want to stop being a man defined by what almost killed him. I want people to remember this house for something other than a poisoning plot and a wife who had to save her husband from his own paranoia. Zara reached across the table and took his hand, the burnt toast forgotten. Then testify. Tell the truth, plainly, without performing for the cameras or the council. Let the story be exactly what it was, no more, no less. A good man who let fear cloud his judgment, and a woman who refused to let that fear win. That's not a shameful story, Ji-hoon. That's just an honest one. The trial, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. Hyun-woo, stripped of the polish that had carried him through a decade of quiet manipulation, looked smaller in a courtroom than he ever had in a mansion, the way powerful men often do once the furniture of their influence is taken away and all that's left is the person underneath it. He tried, until the very end, to argue that his actions had been reasonable, a man simply claiming what patience and loyalty should have earned him. The judge did not find this argument as compelling as Hyun-woo clearly believed it to be, and neither, notably, did the pharmacist, who had by then developed an even deeper enthusiasm for cooperating with prosecutors, apparently having concluded that testifying against a Mafia lieutenant was considerably safer than the alternative of testifying for one. Ji-hoon took the stand and told the truth, exactly as Zara had suggested. No embellishment, no performance. He described the anonymous messages, the surveillance he'd installed in his own home out of suspicion for a wife who had done nothing but protect him, the poison in his tea, the decade of trust he'd handed a friend who had spent every year of it quietly measuring the distance between himself and the throne. It was not a flattering story. It was, as Zara had promised, an honest one, and there was a strange dignity in that honesty that no amount of counsel-approved spin could have manufactured. Zara testified too, walking the courtroom through 3 months of parking garages and burner phones and a private investigator who charged triple for discretion and was, by the end of it all, tempted to ask for a raise given everything she'd witnessed. She spoke plainly about the fear of accusing a made man without proof, about choosing patience over panic, about protecting a husband who, for a significant stretch of that timeline, had been actively suspecting her of the very crime she was working to prevent. "Did that anger you?" the prosecutor asked. "Being surveilled by your own husband while you tried to save his life?" Zara considered the question with the same unhurried honesty she brought to everything. "It hurt," she said. "But fear makes people do foolish things, and my husband was afraid, even if he'd never have called it that. I'd rather be married to a man capable of admitting he was wrong than one too proud to ever find out." Hyun-woo was convicted on charges that would keep him comfortably out of Seoul's underworld for the remainder of his natural life, a sentence the family council quietly agreed was more merciful than what tradition might once have demanded, though nobody said that part out loud in the courtroom. Afterward, standing on the courthouse steps in the gray autumn light, reporters shouting questions that neither of them planned to answer, Ji-hoon turned to Zara and said the thing he'd been carrying since that first night on the study floor, next to the ficus that had witnessed entirely too much for a houseplant. "I keep thinking about how close I came to losing you. Not to Hyun-woo. To my own suspicion. If I'd trusted my fear over you, if I'd acted on those messages before I ever asked you a single question, I don't know what kind of man I would have become." "You'd have become exactly the kind of man Hyun-woo needed you to be," Zara said. "Isolated. Paranoid. Easy to poison. Easy to manipulate. Easy to bury under a story everyone else got to write for you. That's the real danger in stories like ours, Ji-hoon. It's never really the enemy standing in front of you making all the noise. It's the doubt he plants quietly in the people who are supposed to be on your side, hoping you'll do his work for him without even realizing it. The loudest villains lose. It's the quiet ones, the ones who convince you to distrust the very people protecting you, who almost always win, unless somebody in the story refuses to let the silence do the talking for them." It was, Ji-hoon thought, the kind of lesson that applied to considerably more than Mafia successions and marriages under surveillance. It was the kind of lesson that applied to anyone who had ever let a rumor, an anonymous voice, a carefully planted doubt, convince them to turn against the person actually standing in their corner. The Hyun-woos of the world rarely announce themselves. They whisper, they wait, and they count on everyone else staying silent, distracted, or too quick to assume the worst about the wrong person. The only defense against that kind of quiet poison is exactly what Zara had done from the very beginning: paying attention, refusing to look away, and speaking up before the damage becomes permanent, rather than staying comfortably quiet and letting the loudest lie win simply because no one bothered to challenge it. 1 year later, the mansion looked much the same from the outside: imposing gates, manicured gardens, the same fountain where Ji-hoon had once realized how thoroughly he'd misjudged the most important person in his life. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The soundproof surveillance room had been converted, at Zara's insistence, into a nursery, painted a soft, defiant yellow that In-suk privately thought was undignified for a family of their standing and publicly admitted was the most beautiful room in the house. Ji-hoon still kept a single recording device, the very first one Beck had ever installed, tucked in a drawer in his study as a reminder of exactly how close paranoia had come to costing him everything that mattered. Zara still watered the ficus herself, some things a woman does not delegate, and still hummed off-key while she cooked, unbothered as ever by an audience she no longer needed to hide from. The council, to their credit, eventually stopped calling her inappropriately ungrateful and started calling her something considerably more accurate, though considerably harder for men like Taesung to say out loud: essential. And Kang Ji-hoon, once a man who believed loyalty was earned through actions and love was loyalty with better lighting, learned at last that real loyalty rarely announces itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it simply sits quietly in parking garages at midnight, refusing to give up on a man too stubborn to know he needed saving, until the truth finally, unmistakably, came home.